So it's nice to not have to explain what an idea is, or what discourse is. So my project that I'm going to present today is actually my master's thesis, which I completed part-time recently. And it's looking at renewable energy policy in the UK using a discourse, critical discourse analysis approach. And I look at the non-fossil fuel obligation and the transition to the RO, the renewables obligation, and now the current electricity market reform changes. And as I said, I use critical discourse analysis approach initially, and then I interviewed quite a lot of stakeholders across the policy environment, including government and the regulator. This chart is showing how complicated, these are only the aspects relevant to renewables policy within the energy system. And so this is kind of the transition that we all know, from the NOFO to the RO, to the small-scale fits, to the EMR reforms at the moment. And I broadly focus on these kind of three periods of time, from 1989 privatisation to 2002 to the RO, and then to the current 2011 changes. And this bit down here is showing all the other considerations that I kind of had to build into my little model. And then you've got things like the Electricity Act going on, which are really informing your policy environment. But then also you've got renewable energy targets from the EU and massive transmission changes from Ofgem influencing that system. We should never forget Ofgem. Okay, that's quite important. So what I do throughout the project is I look at two types of discourses. I look at primary discourses, which are answering the question, why regulate? Why does there need to be any form of regulation? And then later on I examine secondary, what I call secondary discourses, which are kind of like Hall's second order of change in how do you regulate and what forms of regulation you use. But these are answering the question of why regulate at all? Do we need to regulate for scientific reasons, economic reasons, or for communicative reasons? And communicative is a bit misleading here. It means kind of public policy reasons, public good reasons. They focus on the environment, the interface of the physical with the social. And it's a very broad term, possibly slightly misleading one. Scientific rationality we're all familiar with, and economic rationality, I hope that's costs, that's prices. And throughout my paper, I look at these key terms and how often they come up throughout the literature and throughout the policy documents that I analysed. I also looked at secondary discourses. These are the types of discourses that inform what mode of regulation you take. So the top three here, administrative rationalism, democratic pragmatism, and economic rationalism, they're all centred around the idea that government can fix this, technology can fix this, the democratic process and economics can fix whatever problem it is we think we have. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, survivalist and green radicalist discourses focus on the idea that we need to have a radical transformation, we need a paradigm change, both in terms of consumption, but also in terms of population and things like that, really crazy out ideas. If I was presenting this to an electricity audience, they would call me a crazy lunatic. And I also incorporated sustainability and technology-based discourses as separate themes, more to understand where they fit in to formation of ideas, rather than saying all energy policy is based on sustainability. That's not the idea of this, is to understand the interplay between these ideas. So this is my kind of overall findings. The doctrinal rationalities, this is just how many references I have. So this is a very generic, qualitative way, but I just wanted to use it as a scoping demonstration of what's out there. And so in the policy documents that I looked at, scientific rationalities and economic rationalities are present in the overall documents, in the this is what we should do, this is our Climate Change Act type documents, whereas communicative rationalities weren't present really at all. And in the secondary regulatory rationalities, these ones, you see the colours probably there? Yeah, dark blue, dark teal, light teal. These dark teal ones in the middle are ones where nature is valued as less important than human needs, whereas the kind of more extreme rationalities, democratic pragmatism, survivalism, green radicalism, they value nature inherently with public needs. And that's kind of my first initial finding that I came across that made me start thinking about what role ideas can play as part of this. Within the doctrinal findings, we find that there's been a massive increase in kinds of the terminology that people start to use. Gosh, I really wish to speed up. And that, again, communicative rationalities are less powerful than the other two. This really gets interesting when we look more closely at what's going on here. In that, these two rationalities, economic and administrative, are zooming off into their trajectory throughout the EMR period, and that they're really converging on the type of idea that costs are important and price is important, but very little else is. What I've tried to do is feed these ideas and these initial findings into Sabatier's advocacy coalition approach, and this is kind of his idea up here, which I consider, in that deep core and policy core and secondary aspects, and you can relate this to the previous presentation on Hall's first and second and third order change. To relate that idea that there is a held deep core in a policy belief system within scientific, economic, technology and social equity discourses in this area, and that these deep core beliefs inform what we should do in our policy, and then all the secondary aspects in terms of choice of regulatory mechanism. And the biggest finding here is that ideational beliefs with relation to social equity are framed purely in terms of economic cost. So a consumer social affordability of energy is focused on the affordability aspect, and not the social justice aspect. I've fitted this into this is Ryden's core diagram of what external voices, what role where external voices can have inputs into the policy process. So this is kind of a diagram about how linguistic resources are used in communication and what outcomes this creates. But what's interesting here is that external voices only have, external people only have voices in two areas. And I would consider myself an external voice, so this is quite a broad definition of what is external. You can have external rhetoric in terms of international agreements and EU policy. You can also have external data, this is policy assessments. This is bodies like Ofgem feeding back into the policy process. But you can also have negative impacts of policy, which is coming back into your feedback loop of saying things, doing things, and then them having an impact on what you say again. And of the first two, what's really interesting is that I found that external data and external forces can be ignored or dismissed very easily by policymakers. If you think about a kind of internationally agreed climate change target, the government, it's very easy for the government to say, yes, well, what we're already doing will enable us to meet that, and therefore they don't have to change any of their economic instruments. The one that's harder to ignore is negative feedback for policy. But if I think of something like the fuel poverty, for example, and fuel poverty subsidy that is given to the elderly, that's given to all elderly. That's not, so rich elderly people don't need that. Quite a few of them give it back to a charity to say help other people who are less well off in their old age and need that subsidy more. But the government doesn't have a strategy to deal with that, and its strategy to deal with that is say, oh well, it's not a perfect economic mechanism, but that's it, we're keeping it. And so that negative impact of that policy just is kind of ignored or accepted within the system. And so I kind of propose this as a closed loop regulatory system within the paper. The key conclusions directly from this work is that environmental problem solving, including administrative rationalism, democratic pragmatism and economic rationalism, only have limited explanatory power because economics is in there, but administrative and democratic processes are to a lesser extent, which is directly related to this point, in that survivalist, green radicalist and sustainability discourses have very little relevance within UK renewables policy, outside of the reinforcement of economic rationales. And thirdly, ecological modernisation, as called by Haya, has substantial explanatory power, but that we should really research this more. So I will leave these up, because I guess I'm out of time. In that, these are three areas that I think need further research, and this was really just the initial scoping area, a scoping project. And I would like to understand the role of government accountability further, looking at technological risk versus investment risk, and then doing kind of network analysis and further advocacy coalition work. So I'll just leave those up as we talk. Otherwise, finished. Thank you.